different from the history of America. And Americans have had a history of relatively uninterrupted success. The Chinese have had a very long history of repeated crises. America has had the good fortune of being free of immediate dangers. Chinese have usually been surrounded by countries that have had designs on their unity. It's necessary that each side learns enough about the basic views of the other and above all of the basic principles and definition of the national interest of the other to begin a dialogue. What we can learn from history is that that great catastrophes can occur if societies slip into a conflict on the basis of having repeated these conflicts for a long time until suddenly it blows up, which is how World War I started. The issue itself was no different from 10 others that had been dealt with in previous decades. But this time, the method of diplomacy that had been used then didn't work. We need an effort designed to avoid the worst. Of course, each side will defend its national interests, and this will be understood. And we should not turn this into where can we conciliate China. The issue is, can we achieve outcomes which both sides can coexist?
Do you think Donald Trump has done that, has helped this process when it came to China? Has he delineated a position? Has he done anything that has helped this, or has it just purely been a downhill path?
I think Trump has a more confrontational method of negotiation than you can apply indefinitely. At the beginning of the process, it was important for him to emphasize the deep concerns Americans have about the evolution of the world economy that is not balanced. I think that was important to emphasize. But since then, I would have preferred a more differentiated approach.
Do you agree with and there is an idea around the people around Biden that there should be some element to unite the democracies into some kind of coalition? Do you think that makes sense at all, or is that a provocation?
I think democracies should cooperate wherever their convictions allow it and or dictate it. I think a coalition aimed at a particular country is unwise, but a coalition prevent dangers is necessary where the occasion requires it. Certainly the United States has a historic interest and a history of an Atlantic relationship which should always be kept in mind in the conduct of our foreign policy.
Just on that subject, is there anything that Europe can do? What is Europe's role in this?
The question for them now is whether in the evolution of relations with other parts of the world, they will attempt to be whether they will attempt to play a totally autonomous role or whether they see that there is an importance of some common Atlantic positions. In other words, does Europe think of itself as a peninsula at the edge of Asia, or is it linked to the United States through history and some common interests? And then the answers to the challenges will have to be evolved in relation to the answer to these questions.
Which way do you guess Europe will go on that? Do you think Europe will see itself as a transatlantic alliance, or do you think it will be pulled towards Eurasia?
I think there will be tendencies in both directions, and it is a big challenge for Europe and for the United States.
Can I ask you about one last thing, because it has been such a big issue in the year since we spoke? What is the effect of COVID on the balance of power? Has COVID changed the balance of power? Many people have seen a pandemic which America has not coped with particularly well if you look at the numbers of deaths, and they have looked and they've seen China in particular doing after a shaky start. Has COVID changed the balance of power in your view?
In practice, it is dealt with by each country largely autonomously. But its long-term solution has to be on some global basis. Then within that framework, the performance of countries that solve the problem both of their internal medical needs and of the global or regional method of solving it may affect the position of those countries. But I don't think COVID should be dealt with from that point of view. It should be dealt with as a lesson in the need of certain issues that can only be dealt with on a large basis, hopefully even a global basis.
And is that what you referred to at the beginning in terms of a framework of issues that China and America could come round together on? You could do COVID, climate change, trade.
I'm not saying that we and China will live with a consciousness of harmony. I am saying that there will always be stresses and tensions. But the question is there a direction towards which we can cooperate? And there'll be other issues on which we will differ. But unless there is some basis for some cooperative action, the world will slide into a catastrophe comparable to World War I, with a technology that is even more difficult to control than the technology of the period then.
Henry Kissinger, thank you very much for setting the scene for this new economic forum. Thank you very much on behalf of Bloomberg.
John, thank you so much. Well, coming up next, we have remarks from His Majesty King Abdullah II, Ibn al-Hussein of Jordan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear friends, it is a pleasure to join you at this global forum and to be part of your insightful discussions during such a monumental period in our modern history. As you've been discussing in today's sessions, the COVID-19 pandemic and its repercussions have brought about transformations to our world that come but once every few generations. This is indeed a wake-up call. It shows us that we need each other. It shows us that all life is precious, and it shows us that one country's problem is every country's problem. We cannot simply choose to close our eyes and our ears to the world and expect to survive all this unharmed. Instead of turning our backs on years of international connectivity, imperfect though it may be, we are better served fortifying the foundations of our global system and looking at ways to improve and re-globalize our world. COVID has given us a rare opportunity to do just that, to look at how we can make our world better and more resilient against current and future crises, including the ever-present impact of climate change. 3 immediate areas of concern demand our attention: improving access to healthcare, enhancing food security, and nurturing innovation to catalyze recovery. So, my friends, the pandemic has shown us how connected we truly are. Before it, we are all equal. No one is immune. So let's use our connectivity to fight back by ensuring the efficient distribution of vaccines and treatments. The vaccine, after all, must be treated as a global public good. And for our part, we are ready to deploy Jordan's pharmaceutical industry in service of this mission to guarantee that the vaccine is produced and distributed sufficiently, especially to the most vulnerable communities, such as refugees and families living in poverty. Another issue that we must address is food security. The number of people at risk of hunger is expected to rise to 265 million this year, due to the economic impact of the pandemic, an increase of 130 million. Easing access to modern agricultural technology, especially for farmers in developing countries, is key to improving the quality and availability of food. The agri-food sector in Jordan, for example, supports the livelihoods of about a quarter of the population. It is one of the largest sources of employment for working-age refugees and women in rural communities. And since the onset of the pandemic, it has proven its strong position on the global supply chain. With additional investment and increased resilience on technology, there is room for substantial growth. Indeed, technology has the potential to boost our global path to recovery post-COVID. And one of the bright spots of our pandemic response has been seeing young Jordanians rise to the occasion and come up with innovative digital solutions in record time to bolster our resilience in healthcare, education, and e-commerce, while also offering services to others in the region. This is why empowering and investing in SMEs by facilitating their access to finance, technology, and markets is a must as we work towards inclusive growth and recovery. My friends, COVID-19 has upended our world. Over 1 million precious lives have been lost. Families in every country have lost loved ones to this pandemic. Millions have lost their sources of livelihood. At this forum, I urge you to think of them. And too often, we lose ourselves in the technicalities, the policies, the numbers. As you look at ways to rebuild a more resilient, inclusive world, remember to put people at the heart of your discussions. I wish you every success.
Nigeria has a cash problem. I mean, it's the richest country in Africa with a nominal GDP of over $400 billion. But when it comes to making transactions, most locals pay with cash. In fact, only about 35% of Nigerians even have a bank account. And with a population of over 200 million people, that's a lot of paper floating around. So, a tech entrepreneur named Tayo Oviosu came up with an idea to change the way Nigerians think about money, which quickly set him on a path to becoming one of the country's biggest rising stars of fintech.
If you look at emerging markets, about 95% of transactions are done in cash, and this is very unsafe. Merchants who are selling have to create a variety of processes within their stores to prevent pilferage from their staff. When you're traveling with a lot of cash, you can face theft. And then for the economies, it costs somewhere between 5 to 7% of GDP to clean, process all of that cash. In Nigeria and in really most emerging markets, the reason why cash is still king is first and foremost poor banking infrastructure. So while Nigeria has 23 banks, they only combined have about 5,000 bank branches. So they don't have the reach to the mass market. And so for me, looking at that, I was like, wow, this is a huge problem. There's got to be a better way to pay than me having to pay in cash.
But Oviosu noticed something else.
I have a phone, and I have a phone signal, so why can't I pay with my phone? And that's really what got me going, right?
So Oviosu formed a startup called Paga, which would allow Nigerians to make transactions with their phones, among other services. But one of the challenges was to convince a cash-dependent customer that paying with Paga was legitimate.
It was very clear to me that for us to reach the mass market, we had to build a network of what we call agents. These are mom and pops, pharmacies, grocery stores, people in the local community that are trusted.
The agents provided consumers locations where Paga was supported, while offering the agents a commission on transactions.
So we had to door build out this distribution network, and we now have 26,000 agents. We have 16 million users on our platform. Last year, we did about $2 billion in transaction values processed on our platform.
While Paga will continue investing in local markets, they're planning to expand beyond Nigeria.
Mexico is our next market, and it's actually amazingly similar to Nigeria. And use cash same way. This is the 15th largest economy in the world, but 90% of Mexicans don't even save at a formal financial institution. We're also launching in Ethiopia. So we are making real good headway in terms of solving the problem for payments and access to financial services to the mass market.
And now a panel discussion. Deglobalization, reglobalization, or slowbalization. You can pretty much take your pick. Our speakers are Ning Jija, National Development and Reform Commission of the PRC, Cecilia Malmström, former European Commissioner for Trade, Luis Alberto Moreno, former President IADB, and Rajesh Subramaniam, President and Chief Operating Officer of FedEx. Our moderator for the panel, Richard Haas, President, Council on Foreign Relations.
Well, thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to one and all. Our subject today is globalization, or the lack of it, pushback against it, the momentum of it. We've got a great panel. I think we're 80% of what we were meant to be. Vice Chairman Ning is not with us as yet. Hopefully he'll be able to join us, but in the meantime, we are in great hands. I thought I would begin with Cecilia Malmström, the former EU Trade Commissioner, to open us off on trade. And the most recent round of global trade talks, as everybody knows, did not succeed, the so-called Doha round. So what does that tell us? What does that tell us about trade? And what does it tell us about the future architect of trade negotiations and trade agreements?
Well, trade is still and is going to be very important in the post-COVID world as a part of the recovery. And it is working. It's been working remarkably well during the crisis, despite some hang-ups in the beginning and, of course, a decreased global trade. But there are problems, and they've been around for quite a long time. We've seen trade wars. We have seen the incapacity of WTO to make decisions. It's not working really well. So there are lots of reforms to be made there. WTO is almost having a new Secretary General, which would be very good, and it will need to address all these reforms, everything from the daily work to the decision making to the issues of old issues such as the Doha round that you mentioned, Richard, but also new issues such as digital trade, services, environmental trade, etc. We've seen trade wars, tariffs increasing, but we've also seen a lot of trade agreements going through. Europe has been concluding a lot of them recently with Canada, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, a few African states, and only yesterday we saw the signing of RCEP with China and 14 other countries in Asia. We've seen the countries of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, going forward even when the US withdrew, and that has entered into force. And we see great ambitions in the African continent. All the African Union have set the ambition to create, on the long term, because there's still a lot of work to do, a intercontinental free trade area among the 55 countries of the African continent. So it's a mixed picture. We see protectionism, we see anti-trade movements, but we also see lots of countries who do believe that trade is a good thing, that you need to do it transparently, you need to do it inclusively, but definitely we need to modernize the global trading system, the rules, and the way we do trade globally.
Let me just follow up with one question, which is the division of labor. And what's left then for the WTO? Is it essentially become less of a negotiating forum, and it's essentially there as the Court of Appeals and adjudication forum? Is that now the future division of labor in the global trading network?
Well, I hope not. Of course, the fact that WTO has not functioned as we would like it to has made bilateral or regional trade agreements coming forward to a much larger speed. But WTO is there to set the rules, to involve especially developing countries, and to make sure that we have a global trading system that is predictable, that is rule-based, and that works. And right now, even if there are problems, there are almost 90 countries negotiating a plurilateral, meaning that not all countries of WTO, but most of them on e-commerce, on digital trade. And if that was to succeed, I think we would that would really show that WTO is back on track. And with the dispute settling mechanism that has been blocked for quite some time, also due to the US blocking it, but maybe with the new administration we can engage a couple of reform-willing countries in the WTO to see if we can set a new agenda and if we can set out to modernize and to update the organization, also write some new rules, because of course there are violations of the existing rules and there are rules that are not adapted to the circumstances of today.
Thank you. I want to bring in Raj for a moment here. Look, you are the COO of one of the major global corporations. One of the results, it seems to me, almost a consensus result of COVID-19, is that the world is beginning to rethink supply chains. And questions of just-in-time, questions of costs still matter, but they're no longer, shall we say, paramount. As well, the new phrase is resiliency, and whether the cause is disease or earthquakes or something to do with climate change or politics, we need to build in more. So my question is, how is that affecting you? How is it affecting you see your colleagues in other business? But also, how do we avoid a situation, which I'm increasingly thinking about, where if every country basically says, this is what we're going to do to maintain resiliency or sufficiency, how do we avoid that becoming a euphemism for protectionism? How do we manage this process of strengthening supply chains, but not at the price of global trade?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And let me just first say that, you know, as a practitioner of moving global trade, you know, we think more trade and freer trade is obviously better for the globe. And, you know, we have, you know, our 20 million shipments a day represent really global trade at maybe the higher value end of the global trade, and it is extremely big part of the economy. If I just add one point on the global trade equation, you know, what 1990 trade represented 14% of GDP. In 2008, it was 25%, and in 2018, it was 21%. So it was kind of almost peaked, you know, before even the pandemic hit, and was already coming down a little bit. And then through the pandemic, we, you know, even 2019, manufacturing trade took a big hit. And as the pandemic hit, then things have kind of changed. What's come back faster is actually the manufacturing piece of trade, and the services for very good reason, are down. So while GDP is down and trade is down, manufacturing component of trade has actually performed a little better than the services component. So just in this context that I wanted to talk to you about the supply chain resilience. I think a lot of people are talking about, broadening of supply chain, diversification of supply chain, and it's starting to happen in that respect, that the supply chains are starting to get shorter. The supply chains are starting to get intra-regional. But one of the things that you have to understand is that when people start to talk about from just-in-time inventory to move to just-in-case inventory, there is a price to be paid, and that price is going to be at the end of the day in the cost of goods sold. So, I think there's going to be a tug of war here. There will be certain commodities, certain things that an economy might say, okay, I need to have self-sufficiency, or let's put it more of a quote-unquote safety stock, but not in every one of them. So that's actually going to make the supply chains less efficient, ultimately increasing in cost. So the question is, does that make sense at the end of the day? On the other hand of the tug of war, though, I think we have to play the equation of digital. As more and more information about supply chains, and particularly data, they become really critical in management of supply chains. I think there's an opportunity to get even more efficient because of that. It's a lot of the activity today is, digitization of individual companies, but across the supply chain, there's a wonderful opportunity to be able to be much more efficient through optimization, through digitization. So I think there are, two factors at play. One is you'll see some pullback in the concepts of efficiency from just in time on certain commodities. On the other side, I think because the role of technology is going to drive it on the path forward. So we will see how it goes. I'm an optimist. I hope that at the end of the day, the trading systems and the WTO is reformed to a point where multilateral systems exist and the supply chain resiliency can be achieved to a degree of satisfaction without sacrificing too much of the efficiency.
Thank you. Luis Alberto, I'd like to bring you in on that. Do we need to have essentially a new WTO round where we talk about supply chain resiliency, where basically is the goal to come up with some kind of a common list of critical materials where countries would agree? Because here's what I'm worried about. Maybe tell me if I'm wrong. You've never been worried about telling me I'm wrong before. If every country says, here's the 85 or 185 critical items that we can no longer be dependent upon foreign suppliers for, how do we avoid a situation where legitimate concerns about supply chain resiliency don't become, if you will, illegitimate excuse for countries to practice protectionism? How do we manage this?
Well, this is a very good point, and thank you very much, Richard. And it's great to be with both Cecilia and Raj. And as Cecilia knows well, one of the single most important ways to accelerate trade is everything around trade facilitation. And these would add more to global trade than anything else. As Raj was saying, if you look back from 1986 to today, trade as a percent of GDP is close to 30%. That means that, in the last number of years, really starting with the financial crisis, you saw for the first time a dislocation between global growth and the growth of trade. But certainly, the one risk that you point to is that somehow through the back door, we go to some form of import substitution like we had in Latin America that essentially prevented Latin American countries, as an example, from growing as it did to other emerging markets. Today, the way you can explain much of the growth that's taken place in emerging markets to a large degree, especially Asia is the best example, was because trade represented a significant amount of their overall GDP. And this continues to be true. And I'm of the ones that, yes, the resiliency of global supply chains is going to be key. But the countries that are going to benefit from these are agreements across businesses. But those businesses are going to look at where do you have a more open trading regime. And I'll give you a contrast. Take the case of Brazil and Mexico. Mexico is a much more open economy. Trade as a percent of GDP is much larger as compared, say, to Brazil, the biggest economy in all of Latin America, and yet the overall trade as a percent of GDP is very low. So yes, there will be more regional agreements, but those regional agreements always end up with all these negative lists that essentially prevent the advance of trade. So I think one of the key areas that we need to continuously focus on is everything around trade facilitation. Because as Raj will tell you from his business, these are the areas where at the end of the day, you block the success of any optimization or resilience of any value chain, as an example.
Luis Alberto, I want to follow up on something, particularly given your background, both your national background in Colombia and also your 15 years at the bank. This question of how we generate or maintain support for trade. We're living in an age of not just COVID, but even before, and what will be the future of innovation, of productivity increases. A lot of existing jobs are going to disappear. New jobs are obviously going to come into being, but they're going to require different skill sets. What is your sense on how do we avoid growing opposition to trade in countries like Brazil and Mexico, but around the world? How do we avoid trade being essentially the scapegoat for productivity increases and innovation that eliminates existing jobs? How do we manage this?
It's very interesting because clearly what the history shows us is that it was because of trade that you explained to a large degree the growth in the last 15 years in Latin America. That growth came really from more opening to trade than from being isolated. A lot of that, of course, had to do with a super cycle of commodities. Latin America is largely a commodity exporter. But notwithstanding, even as a region, consistently when you look at polling of what people believe in terms of trade, people want to see more intra-regional trade. And yet somehow we have all these forces that prevent that from happening, from really on the trade facilitation or non-tariff barriers type of ideas. On the other hand, I think what is very damaging is what happens in developed countries when you start seeing all these protectionist forces that immediately only fuel those who feel that are threatened by trade because of their businesses. And let me just give you one example. When COVID started, the first thing that we noticed because of this lack of global cooperation was that a lot of countries had very high trade protections for PPE. And that came basically because in many of the trade agreements, people would hide behind many of these tariff barriers. Well, immediately governments had no choice but to totally bring them down. And that, as a result, brought about a lot of manufacturing, a lot of countries having to resolve some of the PPE challenges, from respirators to face masks, you name it. So this is a very interesting example of how we somehow forget areas of trade and trade facilitation that, in my view, are critical.
Cecilia, can I complicate things even more? One of the growing conversations in the ideas business is obviously what we're going to do about climate change. And people look at Paris and they look at cap and trade, they look at carbon taxes, and they say, these are all potentially fine, but there's unlikely to be global consensus. So what is your view about the wisdom as well as the viability of using trade as a vehicle to promote climate ends? Historically, there's been things like labor conditions, but what would be wrong with, say, the TPP or some other group saying, if you want to export to us, you have to meet these standards in terms of, say, fuel use. And if you don't meet these standards in terms of fuel use, we're going to put a tariff on you in order to encourage you to evolve your economy. Is that the sort of thing that you'd like to see? Is that the sort of thing that you think we will see?
I think we will see that. Trade obviously needs to play its part in the transition to a climate-friendly society, a fossil-free society, if we want to accomplish the Paris goals. So there's already in many trade agreements existing today, there are chapters on sustainable development, setting some targets on environment and sustainable development. The EU doesn't enter into trade negotiations unless the country has signed up to the Paris Agreement and also has obligations on to comply with EU environmental agreements. So I think we are heading in that direction, and that's also what the citizens, the consumers, are expecting from us. So one thing to do globally would to restart negotiations that have been in the freezer for a while to facilitate trade in environmentally friendly goods. That was a negotiation that included both China, US, EU, and several other countries, and to take away tariffs on technology that is climate friendly. That would be a good thing to restart, and not very difficult, actually. The other thing on carbon taxes or border adjustment taxes that is being discussed in different areas of the world, that is complicated because you need to make sure that that is done in a non-discriminatory way, that it's compliant with WTO rules, etc. I think it can be done. Maybe you can start sector-wise. There are lots of brilliant minds thinking about this right now, and there are different organizations who are starting to think it over. It should probably not be done in small regions. It should be done as global as possible. OECD would be the perfect place to do that, involving, like the digital tax that is discussed there. 135 countries are engaged. So we need to get it right, but it can be and it will be part of the future trade. So we better prepared, but we need to get it right.
Raj, you're basically a delivery company, which means that you're also you're in the transportation business. You're transporting goods. When you hear this conversation, how uneasy does it make you? Or to what extent are you both anticipating it and conceivably even welcoming it? Is there opportunity for you or risk in this? And in particular, if you're dealing with the world that doesn't have a common standard. So what is it you're looking for here?
Well, before I go into that question, I just want to go back to the point about trade was mentioned earlier. I think at the end of the day, you're 100% right. We have built a global network where we can pick up something from any one part of the world and set it down in any other part of the world in a matter of 1 or 2 or 3 days. And there is significant benefit for the global economy for that power of connectivity. In fact, our core purpose is to really connect people and possibilities. And that's what this is about. So when we talk about trade, for example, we're talking about the government policies and, multilateralism and so on and so forth. And I do hope, like Louis said, that the TFA and the non-tariff barriers, at least, that there is a much easier way to deal with that. However, there is this aspect of just human beings. As human beings, people want to trade and travel. And, today's age, with technology that we have today, with a device like this, you can now connect your products and services to all around the world. And with a system like ours, you can actually get it there. So we do believe that our larger purpose of FedEx is really that connecting people and possibilities around the world and really take standards of living, take it upwards as we open up new markets for people. So it is in this context that you got to look at the conversation on environment. Of course, we are very much in the game. We know what we have to do. We continue to increase our fuel efficiency of the way we operate. We continue to put electric vehicles. We continue to put our facilities on non-fossil fuel. And I think those are all necessary conditions. In addition, we're going to be working very closely to actually, on the science, to some of the key institutions to change the game on actually solving the problem too. So 100% committed to that and do it in a way that we achieve both goals of being, environmentally friendly as well as connecting people and possibilities.
Thank you. Luis, if Vice Chairman Ning had been with us, we would have talked about the whole question of technology, both competition as well as export controls. He's not with us, but I think we need to raise the issue in any case, which is this meeting is taking place in a context of growing friction between China and not just the United States, but many other countries over many issues, strategic issues, human rights issues, but obviously also trade and technology issues. I'd be curious hearing from you and then from Cecilia about your view about how we manage this. How do we manage to maintain, if you will, areas of trade that are clearly don't involve issues of technology transfer that could affect competitiveness or intelligence collection? How do we maintain those, and how do we basically introduce some filters on the other? What is your sense of how we go about this?
Well, as you mentioned, Richard, the reality is that these whole tensions between China and the U.S. and this kind of unraveling that we have been discussing in the forum, as it was last year when we were all together in Beijing. The reality is that the way that then translates to regions of the world. Let me just speak to one that I know best, which is in Latin America. Countries like Brazil, like Argentina, Peru, and Chile, just to name a few, 30% of their trade today is with China. So, and that trade with China essentially helped those countries grow over the last decade and a half because of the boom in the commodities that we had in part of those years. Now, take that to the technology space, and there is a huge acceleration taking place because of COVID in terms of uses of technology. There's a set of challenges in the way that people can access. There is not enough access to bandwidth. People in the lower income parts of society have a heavy burden to pay. Sometimes the connectivity can represent anywhere from 10 to 50% of their income. But the reality is this: countries need to upscale their total technological capabilities. And the answer, therefore, is you must make a choice. And I believe, on the contrary, that we are not talking enough about some of the possibilities that you could do integrating more of these technology streams across, for instance, the Americas, or for that matter, in other parts of the emerging world. So I do believe that we need at least some basic agreements that would allow countries to work through this, because nobody wants to make a choice between dealing with one or the other. And I think this is a very difficult issue for countries where their trade is very important with the rest of the world. It was that diversification of trade with Asia that allowed many countries to grow. And so this, I think, is the million-dollar question that we need to resolve. And that's why, as Cecilia was mentioning, we need a stronger WTO where these things can be addressed and wherever challenged and resolved.
Luis, let me ask you one other question while I've got you here, which is, you've got a new Biden administration in 2 months. What is the potential for a new hemispheric trade agreement? What's the political potential? What actually would it accomplish? What ought to be the essence of one if you could build political support for it? What's on the agenda?
Well, first of all, the region of the world with which you have the largest number of trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, is in Latin America. You have, as we of course know, the USMCA, but equally you have one with Central America, you have one with Colombia, with Ecuador, with Peru, with Chile, and you were at least beginning a process to have a discussion with Brazil. I do believe there is clearly an opportunity to move into an area that at a minimum begins to converge on a set of rules that you can have in this change of global supply chains, not just things made in America, but made in the Americas. For that to happen, rules of origin and rules of accumulation are going to be critical to allow, for instance, say countries in Central America, which are basically the ones where most of the migrants coming into the United States can have an option. By the way, I had the chance to work very closely with Vice President Biden at the time. He devoted a lot of effort not only to Latin America throughout, especially the second term of President Obama, but especially with the countries of the so-called Northern Triangle, which are Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where most of the illegal migrants were coming into the United States. Imagine those countries having the possibility to having access to the North American trade agreement and essentially be a part of this agreement and moving some of the production down from Mexico into those countries that are basically lower in terms of labor costs and that could advance significantly in keeping their people there in those countries by providing job opportunities.
Thank you. Cecilia, let me ask you a similar question, which is about the future for the U.S.-EU trade agenda. I'll be nice, and I won't ask you about Brexit. I just want you to know, I figured we all deserve a break from that for at least an hour. But what about the U.S.-EU? Given your former hat, is there a complementarity there that you could see that is realistic?
Well, it would certainly make sense. Because EU and US, we trade for billions every hour, and we are each other's most important trading partner. We did negotiate this TTIP agreement. It was difficult, even under the former Obama administration. And I think we should not expect neither Europe, neither the Biden administration to rush to the negotiating table to take that out of the freezer. There has been a considerable lack of trust between the EU and the US in trading area the last year, so we need to rebuild that. And also, this is probably not a priority for the Biden administration. But what we could do is to identify a few targeted issues where it would make all the sense in the world to cooperate on some standards, technological standards, environmental standards. We could take away some tariffs of a more technical nature, and we could cooperate when it comes to investment screening. You mentioned China before. There has been cooperation there to how to set up proper screening mechanisms to screen investment, not to stop them, but to be increasingly aware of some that might threaten public security or critical infrastructure. So I hope that we can resume trade discussions and also reform discussions on WTO and the multilateral system with the Biden administration. But I don't think anybody in the EU expects a resumption of bilateral trade talks, at least not the first 2 years.
Thank you. Raj, at some point I expect we may get some questions from others, but for the meantime, you're stuck with me. Here you are again in a senior position in one of the world's great corporations. What is it you're looking for from, if you will, the political authorities? What is it you're hoping that governments provide you as a business, either for planning purposes or operating purposes? What do you want to see? But also, what is it you're really also hoping they don't do to you?
Well, thank you for that question. I think, firstly, we stand firmly in the side of more and open trade. So, to the extent that the barriers come down, it is better. Not, we think it's good for the global economy. Of course, we'll do our part in moving the goods across the borders. And the second part of the equation is, okay, whatever the tariffs are, the non-tariff barriers, if they are actually smoothed out across and commonalized across the world, or at least some of the major economies of the world, it'll help significantly to move the traffic. Third is the role of technology. We just talked about that to Louis earlier. I think if I bring it down to a level here, as I said earlier, the technology layer that goes across different companies may be helpful significantly with trade. And in this particular context, blockchain might be an answer. As we establish provenance all the way to the beginning of that supply chain, and there's a ledger that keeps up with where that came from, it'll help the governments as well as we keep track of that. And then lastly, I would say is, a lot of the emerging markets are looking to be a source of manufacturing, perhaps another point in the manufacturing ecosystem around the world. I think it's important that people keep in mind that manufacturing policy goes hand in hand with logistics policy. Just to give an example, in the US, logistics cost represents about 8 or 9% of the global GDP. If you take any emerging market, you would see that the logistic cost is roughly double that, and hence is significantly more inefficient. To the extent that the emerging economies focus in on logistics policy as part of their manufacturing push to establish both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, I think it'll pay off in a big way.
Rush, you've got tens of thousands of employees, of probably millions of customers around the world. The title of this session is deglobalization, reglobalization, and something I've never heard, slowballization. Tell us what you do in terms of your employees, your customers, the broader public. How is it? What is it you're doing in trying to create an environment that is supportive of what you've talked about today? You obviously want a world of open trade. You want a world of openness more broadly. You want a world of collective rulemaking rather than necessarily national rulemaking. What is it that you found is working in terms of almost the educational role that you're doing as a corporation, both in the United States, but really as a global corporation?
Well, let me attack that problem in two different areas. One is, we have been vocal proponents of global trade and open trade at that from the very get-go, and we continue to do that even during the last few years when this conversation has been difficult. And I think, we have been supportive in any areas that have helped facilitate more trade. So it doesn't matter where in the world we are working with. At the end of the day, we are a global company, but we are also a very local company, and we work hand in hand directly with the government to help facilitate trade. We have suggested technological solutions to make sure that the crossing of the borders becomes as simple and seamless as possible. So that's on one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is working with businesses, small and medium in particular, around different parts of the world, again, to connect them with the other parts of the world and open their market spaces up. We have countless examples of customers who have now, serving markets. When people start businesses, they start thinking normally where their geography is, whether it's a city or the state. But nowadays, a lot of the businesses start thinking immediately, say, how do I get my products global? And that's because of what I said earlier about the role of technology and role of physical networks, and we sit at the intersection of the two. So no, we play a big role. By the way, as the pandemic hit, the role that we played in distributing PPE was, I think, a showcase in that sense. More than almost 2 billion masks, just to give an example. I think the biggest airlift since the Berlin airlift in 1948 in terms of the number of healthcare-related material that moved to different parts of the world. So I think that those are the concrete things we are doing that actually showcases the globalization.
That's great. I didn't know that. Luis Abete, you come from a part of the world where populism, shall we say, is a powerful political tradition. So here's this conversation here about globalization, including but not limited to trade. From your experience, what works? How do you create a public conversation, whether it's for companies like FedEx to thrive in or just for governments to pursue policies they want? What is your sense of what works in order to creating, if you will, political space for open economic policies as opposed to more closed ones?
Look, this is clearly the reasons for populism in Latin America really go back to the fact that we've had so much inequality, really and continue, unfortunately, to have the highest inequality in the world. And as you learned in the United States, the minute you have inequality, you open this huge political cleavage that allows for populism from right and left. In Latin America, it goes back to the days of Perón to Chavez, if you want. What is interesting, though, is that countries, after seeing what import substitution did and how much, that retarded growth in many Latin American countries. It was really in the cycle of the 90s when countries began to really move, alongside a world trend, which was the trend of globalization, that they saw the benefits of trade in two directions, not only in the growth of exports, but equally in the quality and the price of goods that they could have access to were very, very expensive. Now, and that also came together, frankly speaking, in many countries that had debt to equity, very high debt levels that required structural change, and those came really from, institutions like the IMF and the IDB and others that were pushing in this set of reforms. It's never easy because, of course, you affect some local industries, but that is what I think somehow we, in the last number of years, have slowed the process of continuing to open trade. And this is why it's so important that we see really a conversation around the benefits of trade, regardless, and as I said earlier, how damaging it can become when you have, a conversation against, in essentially in closing down trade, in this whole notion of making things only in one country, that automatically, awakens all these anti-globalization forces. What works is really when you look at it in terms of industries, in seeing how, supply chains become so much more efficient. And as was said earlier here, I do believe that now more than ever, because of COVID, companies are going to really think hard about, where to put their supply chains, where the resiliency is. And that's only going to happen at the level of businesses. And as Raj said, I really think that, we underestimate the power of logistics to facilitate trade. From, we've done, a lot of work in electronic single windows, in using blockchain to determine, a lot of movements of goods on the efficiency of custom systems. The whole question of what's called the de minimis clause, which allows for much more electronic commerce. This is an era that we're entering and that people are going to demand, and it's only going to grow. COVID simply accelerated these processes, and so now the pressures are going to come a lot on the logistics and then how economies are open, and these, I think, will be the drivers of how you get more global trade into emerging economies.
Thank you, sir. I just want to make sure I understand. We're running out of time, but I was just informed that Vice Chairman Ning has joined us. Is that correct?
Because it's sort of disturbing to, okay.
I'm sorry, I can't hear. Okay, no, I is wrong. Cecilia, I'm going to give you the last word, but a short one, which is in Europe, the case for the EU and global, which is essentially was the original regional manifestation of globalization in some ways. Do you think that the revival of the Franco-German relationship we're seeing, where the EU is off its back foot and that it's gained momentum, in a sense, one of the winners of the pandemic in that sense, or not?
Wow, that's a long question. Well, I think the European Union has learned quite a lot from this pandemic as well. And as we've been squeezed between the US and China for quite some time, it is trying to define a more geopolitical future, trying to see what can be done in order to take a more global political role as well. Not only the economic recovery, which will be very important, to continue to take the environmental leadership in the world together with others, but also see how we can play a more foreign policy role. And that is a discussion that is ongoing, security, defense, foreign policy, and hopefully the COVID crisis will be an extra input to those discussions as well. And the Franco-German relationship is important, has grown in importance since our British friends left.
Well, good. Let me
but there's
thank
still 25 others.
There are still 25 others. I want to thank Cecilia Malmström, the former Trade Commissioner, Luis Alberto Moreno, former ambassador to my country, but also the head of the IDB for 15 years, and Raj Subramaniam, COO, President and CEO of FedEx, for their contributions to this conversation about the future of globalization, deglobalization, and what I've now learned is called slowballization. So thank you all.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, Richard, we learned a lot. We are honored right now to present remarks from Wang Qishan, the Vice President of the People's Republic of China.
各位嘉宾，很高兴出席
Distinguished guests,
2020年
I'm
创
very
新经济
pleased
论坛。
to attend the
我
2020
期待
New
同各
Economy
位嘉宾
Forum.
一起立足当下，
I look
感
forward
悟历
to
史，
working with you
辨析
to
潮
examine
流
the，current state of the
激励
world,
创新，
get
汇聚共
inspiration
识。
from history, identify the trend of
去
our
年以
times,
来，
encourage
国际形
innovation,
势
and
更
build
加错综
consensus.
复杂。
Since last
在
year,
新
the
冠
world
肺
has
炎疫
become more
情和
complex.
其他因
Due to
素叠加在影
COVID-19
响
and
下，
other complicating
世
factors,
界面对的老
old
问题
problems
依然
continue to
存
haunt
在
the，world,
新风险挑
and
战
new
显
risks
著增
and
多。
challenges are conspicuously
全球
growing.
经济深度
The
衰
global
退，
economy
新
is
科
in
技
deep
革
recession,
命和产
and
业
the
变
new
革
revolution of
仍
science
在
and technology
酝酿
and industrial upgrading are still in
经
the
济、
making.
社会、文化
Structural
等
changes
领域
are
正在
taking
发生
place
结
in
构性的
political,
变化，
economic,
求
social,
和平、
and
求
cultural
稳
areas,
定、求
and the
发
call
展的
for
呼声
peace,
更加高
stability,
涨。
and development has become all the more
越是在
resounding.
困难的时期，越要
Greater
同舟共济
adversity。necessitates
国
greater
际社会要用
solidarity.
实际行动
The
展示
international
维护
community
共同利益，
must take
追
real
求
actions
共同
to
目
show
标
the
的
resolve
决心。
to safeguard common interests
我
and
再次
pursue
强调，
shared goals.
中国始
I want to
终是
stress
世
once
界和
again
平的建
that
设者，
China will always
全
be a
球
builder
发
of
展
world
的贡
peace,
献者，
a contributor to global
国际
development,
秩序
and
的
a
维
defender
护者。
of the international order.
我们愿不断地扩大同
We are
各国的
prepared
利益
to
交汇点，
expand the confluence of
建设
interests with
相
other
互尊
countries,
重、公
promote
平正义
a new type of
合作共赢
international relations
的新
featuring
型
mutual
国际关
respect,
系，
fairness,
推动
justice,
构
and
建
win-win
人类
cooperation,
命运
and
共
work
同
for
体。
a community with a shared future for
各位
mankind.
嘉宾，
Distinguished guests,
2020年是中
this
国
year
决胜全
is
面建
crucial
成小康社
in
会，
China's efforts
决
of
战
building a
脱
moderately
贫攻坚
prosperous
之年，
society in all respects,
是抗击
and
新冠肺
eradicating
炎疫
poverty.
情取得重
It
大
is a
战
year
略成
when
果之
China
年，
secures major strategic
也是
progress in
谋划
epidemic
未来
response.
5年发展
And
规
it
划
is also a
和
year
15
when China
年
draws
远
up
景目
development
标，
plans for the next 5
即
years
将
and
开
long-range
启
goals for the next
全
15
面建
years,
设社会
and
主义
gets
现
ready
代化
for
国
the
家
new
新
journey
征程
of
之年，
comprehensively building a modern socialist country.
站在新的历史起点，
At this new
我们
historical
将
starting
直
point,
面变局，
we will face up to
贯
the
彻
changes,
新发展理念，
follow the new development
构
philosophy,
建以
and
国内
forge
大
a
循环
new
为主体，
development paradigm
国内国
with
际
domestic
双循
circulation
环
as the
相互促
mainstay
进的
and
新
domestic
发展
and
格局，
international circulations
更加
reinforcing
注
each
重
other.
通过内
We
需
will
导向、
strive
质
for
量优
historic
先、
leapfrog
创新驱动、
progress,
协调
which is
发
to be
展、
fueled by
自力
domestic
更生、
demand and powered by
稳中
innovation,
求进的方
emphasizes
式，
quality,
实现
values
新的
coordinated
历史
development,
的跨越。
relies on internal strength, and pursues
人
steady
民对美好
progress.
生活的向往，
The aspirations of the people to live a better life must
我们
always
已
be the
经取
focus
得
of
的
our
发展
efforts.
成就，是几
The
代人
achievement we've
艰
made
苦努力、
is the
艰
result
辛奋
of
斗
the
的结果，
unrelenting hard work
未来
of
的
several
新发展
generations
阶段
of the Chinese people.
也将是一个长期过
Likewise,
程。
the new development stage
面临的
will span
困难、
quite a long
挑
period,
战
and we may
更
face
加
more
严峻复
complex
杂。
and serious challenges.
我们深知，当
We are
今
well
世界
aware
各国利益
that
紧
in
密
today's
相连，
world, interests of all countries are closely intertwined.
中国
China
好
will do well
世界
only when the
才
world
更
does
好。
well. And when China
我们
does
将
well,
坚定不
the
移
whole
地
world
全面
will
扩大开
benefit.
放，让中国市
We
场
will
成
steadily
为
expand
世
all
界的
around
市场，
opening up
共享
and
的
turn
市
the
场
China，market into a
大家的
market
市
for the
场，
world, a market shared by
为
all,
世界
and a
经济
market
复苏
accessible to all
和发
to
展
contribute
做出
our
贡献。
share to world economic recovery and
中
global
国正
development.
以实际行动努力建设
China is
高水
taking
平
real
的开放
actions
型
to
经
build
济
an
新
open
体制。
economy of higher standards.
近年 年来，我
In
们
recent
通过举
years,
办
We have continuously unleashed the potential of the domestic market and expanded import by holding import expos and through other ways. We have reduced restrictions on investment, steadily opened up the financial sector, and advanced the opening of the services sector. We also work hard to build a law-based, world-class, and pro-business environment and protect the lawful rights and interests of all types of businesses without discrimination. We encourage pioneering and trailblazing efforts by pilot free trade zones to become pace setters in opening up. We promote cooperation under the Belt and Road Initiative, advance economic global cooperation at bilateral, multilateral, and regional levels, and endeavor to make economic globalization more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial to all. Distinguished guests, the rationale for international division of labor is still valid, and the trend toward economic globalization remains unchanged. Disasters and difficulties should not be a tipping point toward falling apart. They should be a starting point for the world to join hands together to help daily lives get back to normal and enable the world economy to grow soundly at an early date. We must take the following actions. We should build a collaborative mechanism for epidemic control that brings all parties together. It is important that countries respect science and put life first, increase policy consultation, synergize control measures, coordinated epidemic control and socio-economic development, and stamp the spread of the virus. International organizations should communicate and coordinate, and major countries should show their sense of responsibility and set a good example in the global fight against COVID-19. We should forge a cooperation network for innovation that features common progress. Imposing restrictions on knowledge flows and technological exchanges will only stifle innovation and disrupt global industrial, value, innovation, and supply chains. Countries must rise above exclusive blocks and reject the zero-sum mentality. They should embrace the trend of scientific and technological advances, reduce barriers to the free flow of innovation factors, and promote the sharing of innovation outcomes so as to inject fresh impetus into the world economy. We should build an open world economy that works for all. We must firmly safeguard the multilateral trading system under the WTO and unequivocally reject unilateralism and protectionism. While we endeavor to enlarge the pie of development, we should also look for better ways to share the pie so that development fruits can reach people from all countries, all sectors, and all backgrounds. We should foster a social climate that advocates rationality and accommodation. For humanity as a whole, our common interests far outweigh our differences. It takes a broad mind to accomplish a great cause. We need to recognize our differences, respect uniqueness, consult as equals, build consensus, and pursue win-win cooperation. We need to build platforms for dialogue and keep communications open so that we can deepen mutual understanding through interaction, enhance mutual trust through cooperation, and achieve common progress through mutual learning. In closing, I wish the forum a complete success.
Well, markets are booming while small businesses everywhere are crashing. So what's going on and what's the role of central banks in all of this? Do they serve Main Street or Wall Street? Here to answer those questions are Mervyn King, former governor, Bank of England; Raghuram Rajan, former governor, Reserve Bank of India; Larry Summers, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and Janet Yellen, former chair, U.S. Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Our moderator for this discussion is Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics. Stephanie, all yours.
Well, I want to crack right on with this because we have such an extraordinary panel today and not very much time to get into these important issues about the role of central banks, how they can change, how they can be part of a better global economy coming out of this crisis. There's a model of central banking that spread around the world from the early 90s, independent central banks targeting inflation. We've held on to that. It's had a lot of advantages, but I think our panel, we want to talk about whether there's a better mandate, a different mandate that they need to have now. Let me start by putting a polling question for everyone watching, and we will get the answers to that later on. But the polling question to set the tone for this whole session is, do central banks need a new mission? So your first one answer to that is no, they're doing a great job managing COVID-19 disruptions, or yes, they need to be more focused on inequality. Yes, they do need a new mission. They're out of ammunition. They need a new toolkit. And finally, maybe the easy choice, maybe. But independence from politicians is still essential. We're going to get into all that, but I want to spend a few minutes very briefly thinking about how central banks have responded to the pandemic, what's gone right, and maybe what needs to change. Janet Yellen, what do you think?
Well, I think central banks of the developed countries have done a very good job of responding to the crisis. There could have been a financial market meltdown. There was an overwhelming rush to the safety of cash in March. It threatened massive asset fire sales, which could have caused credit to dry up in the economy. And the Fed and other central banks erected emergency liquidity and lending facilities that have really worked and kept credit flowing in the economy. For example, spreads on corporate bonds were just spiking, and after the Fed set up its secondary credit market facility, they really came way down, and there's been a great deal of issuance of debt. Monetary policy in all the major central banks also became far more accommodative, lower policy rates, expanded asset purchases, forward guidance. In the U.S., both long and short-term interest rates are near historic lows, and they work to boost interest-sensitive sectors, and even here you can see stronger housing and auto sales. But monetary policy has its limits, and the effective lower bound is a serious constraint, and the notion that the Fed can do all that is required at this point to support the economy is just wrong. And the Fed is really pleading for fiscal relief. I believe it's essential. I think the Fed has been less successful in lending to smaller businesses. That creates an impression of unfairness that the Fed is on the side of big companies and on Wall Street. This is something that's very difficult to accomplish. But, you know, as Chair Powell says, the Fed can't spend, it can't give grants, it can't direct aid to where it's needed to unemployed workers, and fiscal policy has a very important role to play now as well.
Lord King, I know you've echoed some of what Janet Yellen has said in repeatedly saying central banks can't do everything. Do you think they've played the expectations game well in responding to the crisis, or have they set them too high?
So I share much of what Janet has said, but I think to explain what's gone wrong, I don't think central banks have explained clearly why expanding the money supply is the right sort of response to a shutdown of the economy created by governments, different levels of governments in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This isn't a conventional recession. And as Janet said, the most important thing for central banks to do now is to say that this is a difficulty, a challenge, which needs government response, not central bank response. And I don't think it's government response in the sense of general fiscal easing. I think it's a response that's required to support businesses until we get through this COVID-19 episode, at which point we can then let the market economy decide which businesses will thrive and which will fail, which I don't think we can do at present. And I think that although the actions taken in March were clearly very important and central banks acted very promptly, it does beg the question that since markets have now calmed down, why that very significant liquidity injection hasn't been withdrawn. And I think what's needed is a proper narrative now to explain why these circumstances merit particular central bank responses. I think we have to get away from the idea that if anything goes wrong, then central banks have to step in and throw money at the problem.
Raghuram Rajan, if you want to respond to what Lord King has said, but I'm also wondering how emerging market central banks, you would say, have responded and matched that challenge that Mervyn has outlined.
Well, Janet talked about the advanced country central banks having done a fantastic job. And I think this did help many emerging markets, which were subject to the same kind of stress that you saw in the beginning of the crisis in March. And the accommodative policies of the Federal Reserve, the ECB, the Bank of Japan helped alleviate some of that EM stress. Also, emerging markets have adopted some of the tools from the Industrial Country Central Bank toolkit to help their governments do the spending, which, as Mervyn said, is extremely important to ensure the real economy doesn't collapse, that you maintain the body economic by helping small and medium enterprises and helping households. That requires spending, and central banks in Indonesia, Poland, across the emerging world have supported their governments. The key question now, of course, is how do you sort of ensure that that bridge, which was built to the end of the virus, it actually extends that far, and there are fears in industrial countries it may be too short. And emerging markets didn't build a pretty strong bridge in the first place because they had very limited resources. And that means that there is far more stress which has built up within the system, which has been hidden by moratoria, by payment sort of postponements. And that stress has to be dealt with. This is not a central bank problem. This is a problem of fixing the judicial system so that it can alleviate stress, fixing the debt renegotiation system. And again, I'll end by saying, so far it's been very good. But whenever you get into these kinds of policies, exit is often a great issue. How do we exit without tanking the system once again? And it's too early to start thinking about it, but it is a question which will face us down the line.
Larry Summers, let's take it as read. If we take from the other three speakers, quite a lot has gone right in the major central banks' response. But what would you have done differently?
Look, the big thing was preventing a financial collapse. The central banks acted definitively to do that. That's all that was ultimately historically important. The mistake is for them to vastly exaggerate their continuing relevance. They lack, starting at the zero bound where we are, the capacity to provide meaningful impetus to their economies in any way that is consistent with any concept of central bank functioning. They do not have the capacity to meaningfully affect the degree of inequality. They do not have the capacity to vaccinate people. They do not have the capacity to fight climate change. And they need to acknowledge the limitations of their influence in a clear way so there can be no pretending about what they're going to do, and that the authorities have the responsibilities they do. The central banks have also, in my view, not put adequate emphasis on the global dimensions of this problem.
a striking feature of the contrast between this crisis and the last crisis is that the last crisis had a major response from the IMF, issuance of SDRs, big increases in lending from the World Bank that was driven by the global community. There has been no boldness at the global level comparable to the boldness at the national level, and that could get us in real trouble down the road, as Raghu points out. And frankly, the central bankers, because they want to curry domestic political favor in each country, have not had enough to say about that.
Just to come back on that, you talk about a lack of boldness. I mean, Larry Summers, you've proposed as one of the things that could happen to support the global system, a big new issuance of IMF special drawing rights, SDRs. We have to ask you, have you persuaded incoming President Joe Biden of that yet?
They'll speak for themselves. I'm optimistic that the U.S. will not be the kind of block on that proposal that it has been before. And of course, it's possible to do substantial things, issuances of $500 billion without congressional approval. So I'm optimistic that we'll see progress on that. But I think that unlike the central bankers of an earlier era, you have seen much less discussion in the central banking community of the global imperative, particularly the challenges necessary if emerging markets are to avoid a wave of financial crises going forward, the issues associated with debt relief. And I think that's been unfortunate. And I have to say, I think it's been because the central banks have been excessively focused with their domestic politics, which leads them to talk about subjects like small business, like the environment, which are really not basically within their proper remit.
Janet Yellen, do you agree that maybe the Fed shouldn't be talking about needing to target the difference between black and white unemployment rates, for example, as it did in this summer, and shouldn't be engaging on these broader agendas, climate change?
So the Fed has always operated under a dual mandate. It's inflation and maximum employment. And in this environment of very low inflation, too low inflation, there's really no conflict whatever between these two goals. And the Fed is really focused on trying to create a very strong job market. And I think that they have made that clear. I'm not sure everyone in the public on Main Street understands that, but full employment is a goal that they ought to pursue. I agree with Larry that the effective lower bound is a big constraint. At this point, they're doing almost all they can do. They need fiscal policy to help. But when they talk about inequality and the disproportionate burdens on minority workers, what they can do is to try to pursue the strongest possible job market. Because when they're successful at that, as they were prior to the pandemic, with unemployment at a 50-year low at 3.5%, that brings benefits particularly to less skilled and minority workers. When job markets are really tight, we saw wages rising most rapidly at the bottom of the wage distribution, workers being pulled off from the sidelines, coming back into the labor market, firms finding it incredibly difficult to hire, lowering qualifications, engaging in their own training to bring people up to speed, willing to hire people that with a weak labor market, their resumes wouldn't have been looked at all. And the Fed has recently revised its framework for conducting monetary policy and emphasized that full employment is a broad and inclusive goal. And they've changed their operating strategy to, and because of the importance of the effective lower bound, to pursue that with vigor. And I think that's appropriate, and I think it's the strongest contribution that central banks can make to trying to deal with inequality. They don't have other tools.
Janet, can I just see whether we're in agreement? I am 100% in agreement with you on the absolute importance of maximizing employment in the current context when there's no real danger of getting inflation to an excessive level. I am in 100% agreement with you that maximizing employment is the best social program of all and confers all sorts of benefits. But don't we think that central banks really need to be careful about holding out the idea that they are relevant to sectoral issues involving differentials between one sector and another, or structural issues like environmental protection? Would you agree, for example, that any idea that the Fed should make special efforts to buy green bonds is a confusion?
So I don't think, I've never heard the Fed say that they're trying to target the unemployment rates or situations of any particular group. In a tight labor market, the gaps, I think, between, for example, the unemployment rates of minorities and whites tends to narrow. I don't think there's anything they can do on that front beyond a generally strong labor market. So it would be a mistake, I think, to say we're targeting the unemployment rate of any particular group. And on sustainable goals, I think it does make sense for in supervision to be taking the risks from climate change, both climate-related risks and the risks of changes in prices and stranded assets as countries adopt meaningful climate policy, to consider that as a risk to banking organizations and to do stress tests to look at that. But of course, we need public policy oriented toward making a big difference on climate change. And I agree with you, that is not something central banks can be asked to accomplish.
I'd like to just add something on what Larry said about inward looking. I mean, to some extent, what you see is the large countries, the large developed countries have become inward looking for obvious reasons because of the political forces within their countries. So there is really no global leadership right now. Hopefully it will emerge. But also, I think the point he made about central banks, that's an offshoot of the fact that there's tremendous pressure to look inwards in these countries. The Federal Reserve had these swaps with a number of countries in the global financial crisis and got a lot of flack for looking outward at that point. So it did start focusing a lot more inward. And so that does leave a vacuum at the global stage on issues of global, transmission of monetary policy, cross-border capital flows, etc., but also the issue that Larry mentioned about cross-border credit, which at this point is heavily under stress.
Mervyn King, we remember the title of this is about Main Street or Wall Street. Given what Larry has said, do you think that central banks or the Bank of England or other central banks have done enough to show that they're supporting Main Street, not just Wall Street? Do you worry about the fact that they are perceived to be propping up asset prices as a main tool of policy at the moment?
Well, I am concerned that the fact that the narrative about why monetary easing has been so strong in these particular circumstances, that narrative hasn't been made clear. So it's not surprising that some people have gone away with the impression that the objective of central banks is to support asset prices. I don't think that is their objective, but I think one can see why some people might think it. I think Larry is absolutely right in saying that the danger with central banks today is that they often give the impression that they're sort of all-purpose, do-good institutions. If there's a problem in the world that exists, central banks have to step in and deal with it. And I think that's a terrible mistake. I think Janet is very compelling in arguing that the dual mandate for the Fed allows the Fed to pursue strategies that will maximize employment. And it's reasonable to argue and to explain why that strategy will have benefits for wider constituencies in the country, not just the aggregate, but individual groups will benefit too. But I do worry that if you like, the new generation of central bankers have been very willing to step into areas that, as Larry said, are clearly for government, and that includes climate change. And I would have thought that one of the big lessons from this episode through which we are now passing is that if we are going to do stress tests on climate change, we certainly need to do stress tests on the next pandemic, whenever that may come. Are we prepared for that? There are many ways in which financial stability is threatened other than climate change. And I think that over the next few years, the big challenge that the world will be facing is dealing with a wave of debt restructurings in both the business and in many cases the sovereign sectors. So I think Larry's right to point to the need for a more global strategy for dealing with this. But one reason this is so difficult, I think, is that over the past 20 years or so, central banks as well as governments around the industrialized world bought into this agenda of unfettered globalization. And we see now a very real pushback to that on very understandable grounds that many people have not benefited from that. And I think, therefore, central banks are naturally cautious before stepping in. But when it comes to debt restructuring over the next few years, central banks need to be part of that global debate. They were when Larry and I were involved 15 years ago, and I think they need to be again.
Larry Summers, the response to this great need, the popular need to show that the policy is more inclusive, that globalization could be more inclusive, and to the long list of things that you said that central banks are impotent about, could be just to say central banks' main role now is just to make large-scale fiscal action affordable, just as they effectively have this year by keeping rates low, making it possible for governments to borrow. Should they just recognize that that is their main role at this point?
I wouldn't put it that way. I would put it that their main role is to support stable, non-inflationary economic growth. And I think for the foreseeable future, that's likely to involve keeping interest rates at very low levels. I think the deep problem, the deep macroeconomic problem that the world has today is that savings are exceeding the natural level of private investment, putting downwards pressure on interest rates to near zero real interest rate or below levels, and leading to sluggish growth and lack of inflation. And that is the world's fundamental problem. And it is not a problem that central banks can on their own resolve. It is a problem that central banks can acknowledge, as Janet certainly has in her period, in the period after she left office, in very strong and clear ways as the evidence has become clearer. But they need to point up this as a problem, recognize that it has important implications for fiscal policy, that it has important implications for the ways in which governments manage their debts, and that they are prepared to do their part. It doesn't necessarily mean explosions in debt, but it does mean careful thought about a range of fiscal and structural policies. But we do need to recognize that whereas from the period from the late 1970s until the early 2000s, the central macroeconomic problems were the temptation to inflate and the crowding out of private investment by budget deficits. Today, the central problem is absorbing all the savings in a healthy way so that we have strong economic growth and we don't have huge leverage and huge financial bubbles. And that is a fundamentally different macroeconomic problem that calls for fundamentally different macroeconomic strategies, of which there may be a role for inflation targeting, but it is largely beside the point in a world where the real problem is insufficient price inflation and excessive asset price inflation. And we need to adjust central banks' paradigm to take account of those realities. Look, if I can say one more thing. The world's financial leaders said after Dodd-Frank was passed, after the Financial Stability Forum did all its things, that we now had a much healthier financial system that could continue to function without large-scale bailouts. Less than 5 years after that was definitively proclaimed, we've had the biggest set of actions directed at propping up the financial system in global history. And while it's looking okay right now, as Raghu said, we're not sure that even what we've done is going to be enough to hold. That suggests the need for a great deal of fundamental rethinking.
Let me just go, we're going to hold that thought. We need to get the polling answers, which I gather are pretty strong. So if we could just bring up what the response from the audience to the poll was. So that's pretty evenly split, actually. I think we gave people too many options, but there's certainly quite a lot of recognition that central banks need to think about new things and new toolkits. If you want to, we're going to go to some questions now. If you want to use the platform to submit some questions, I will be able to put them to this amazing panel. But Janet Yellen, what's your response to what Larry was just saying?
Well, I agree very much with Larry. I think he gave an excellent description of what the core problem is that the developed world faces, that there is a glut of saving and a shortage of investment, and that's why the effective lower bound is such an important constraint, and it's what really means that we have to have fiscal policy, structural policy, and things other than just relying on central banks to keep healthy growth with low inflation. I think central banks need to do what they can, but then not overstate what it's possible for them to do. The Fed has recently concluded a strategic policy review and made adjustments to its monetary policy strategy, adopting a system called flexible average inflation targeting. I think this is an appropriate change. It somewhat improves the scope for monetary policy to support the economy when short-term interest rates are often constrained by the effect of lower bound. I think it's helpful in preventing a cycle of falling inflation, feeding falling inflation expectations. But while I strongly believe central banks need to be independent and need to do everything they can, the changes they've made, they're not a game changer from the point of view of secular stagnation. And bottom line, I agree with Larry on what's required.
You talked a lot about the importance of fiscal policy at this moment. I have to ask you, would you like to be more closely involved in that as a Treasury Secretary for the new administration?
I don't have anything for you on that, I'm sorry.
You don't think you'd be a good Treasury Secretary? Could I ask you that? I could probably ask the rest of the panel that.
It's for other people to decide, I think.
Yeah, well,
Raghuram Rajan.
Yeah, she would be a great Treasury Secretary. But let me talk about another issue, which is related to Larry's secular stagnation idea. I mean, in some sense, the hope for the world was that fast-growing emerging markets and developing countries would provide that demand, which sorely seems lacking at the aggregate level. One of the big concerns we should have with this pandemic is how much scarring has gone on in those economies because they haven't had the ability to provide the kind of fiscal as well as credit support that industrial countries have. So my worry is, apart from the North Asian economies, which seem to have come out quite well from this crisis, many countries in Latin America, Africa, South Asia are going to suffer some diminishing in growth potential going forward. Coupled with some of the impediments to trade that we see, I think this is a cause for concern for the global economy. And it's something that we should do very much, work very hard over the next few years to try and reverse. And that's where Larry's call for global sort of leadership, I think, makes a huge, is of huge importance.
And where should that leadership come from if we don't think central banks should be claiming that they can solve all these problems alone?
Well, right now it seems that there is likely to be change in Washington. Historically, it's been the United States which has taken the leadership. In 2008, 2009, it was, of course, Gordon Brown who, essentially corralled the G20 into doing some of the important actions Larry talked about. But we need somebody to actually take leadership now and corral the countries to doing more, giving direction to the IMF and the World Bank, and as well as perhaps getting some central bank action into this if necessary.
The world central bankers are part of the financial G20. They should be calling for urgent action in the communiques of the financial G20, which ultimately should lead to a leaders G20. The world needs the kind of G20 meeting that took place in London 3 months into President Obama's term to set the terms for a strong global response. This doesn't involve any significant burden on taxpayers in the United States or other industrial countries. SDRs, more aggressive financial engineering from the World Bank. The IMF has twice as much gold by value as it did a decade ago because of the appreciation in the price of gold. There's no reason why it can't be backed to help support doing more for the poorest countries. The private sector has not engaged in any serious way on debt relief and restructuring for emerging markets. We all talk about cooperating with China on the most important global issues. There needs to be cooperation with China on the whole set of issues around support for emerging markets. If central banks could explain not that they can do it, but that ultimately the financial stability of all the institutions they're responsible for, the financial stability of their economies, depends much more urgently on achieving successful global cooperation than it does on anything else. If they could make that case, they would be making a much greater contribution to the current global moment than they currently are.
Mervyn King.
I think it's much more difficult than that. In 2010, the issue was to bring countries together and allow them to do what they all wanted to do individually anyway, which was to ease policy and to deal with a rather narrow problem in a way of collapse of the banking sector. The issue we have now is much broader than that. The problems of emerging market economies or low-income economies are one thing where global cooperation could help, but dealing with the underlying strategic issues facing the global economy is something rather different. And the problem is not the mandate of central banks. It's not the toolkit of central banks. It's actually understanding the forces that are leading the economy to grow very slowly. And understanding what's going on is far more important actually at present than the mandate or the policy framework. That, I think, is what needs to change. And it isn't just expansionary fiscal policy because interest rates are close to zero. It is much, much wider than that to deal with this problem of excess saving in the world as a whole means lower saving rates in some countries, but higher saving rates in others.
Mervyn,
sorry. Go ahead.
I agree with Mervyn, but I think the world looks to the central banking community to explain the nature of the macroeconomic challenges before it, even if the central banks themselves lack the tools to deal with it. And if the central banking community can explain, as Janet just did, as I tried to a little bit in talking about the absorption of saving problem, if that problem can be laid out clearly, that is the first step. Doesn't solve it to lay it out clearly, but it's a crucial step towards the whole range of measures. And you're absolutely right, Mervyn, that it involves a million different things that are necessary to resolve it. But first, we need to define that problem, and that's something central banks can surely do.
I totally agree, and I think the distraction of moving to other policy issues is taking central banks away from what they should be doing, which is explaining this central global challenge.
We could have this conversation all afternoon. I would really enjoy it. It's been a fantastic conversation, but we must move to the next session now. So Lord Mervyn King, Raghuram Rajan, Janet Yellen and Larry Summers, thank you very much.
Well, our closing speaker for this morning's session is Henry M. Paulson, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and co-chair of Bloomberg New Economy Forum.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening to my friends watching in Asia. Let me once again thank my good friend Mike Bloomberg. Mike's vision has underpinned this forum since its inception 2 years ago. Mike understood then that we need to bridge growing differences among nations to assure a peaceful and prosperous future. So I'm delighted to join this forum in its third year, and I'm pleased to see how it has grown and thrived. It's worth recalling that when we gathered for our first meeting, the outlines of our stormy present were already apparent. I remarked then that we'd arrived at a moment of change, challenge, and potentially even crisis. I warned that the prospect of a crisis between the United States and China was leading to the risk of an economic iron curtain. Fast forward 2 years. It gives me no joy to report that those warnings have been borne out. The U.S.-China relationship has become more fraught. We've seen more tariffs. We've seen heightened restrictions on the flow of technology, disruptions in supply chains, more restrictions on investment, and fewer capital flows in fewer sectors. We have fewer exchanges, and fewer students and scholars are heading in either direction. Visas have been revoked. Journalists have been expelled. Consulates have been closed. Proposed acquisitions and investments have been denied. Political rhetoric has become more inflammatory, and it has given us a taste of how debilitating strategic turbulence can be. The pandemic has made the situation worse. The U.S. and China need to work separately, jointly, and with others to end this crisis, and soon. President-elect Joe Biden has a generational opportunity to plot a course for America that allows us to compete and to thrive. I've known Joe Biden for many years. He's a unifier and a patriot. The American administration is about to change, but the clock will not simply be rewound. The Trump administration was responding to real concerns of American people about China and real failures of China to act as a responsible global citizens. The question is how we respond to these legitimate issues. One perverse benefit of the tensions that have characterized the last few years is that the dimensions of U.S.-China strategic competition have become much clearer. Even those of us who didn't agree with every policy choice in Washington or Beijing have come to understand that while new leaders can bring new policies, competition between big powers, and especially between two big powers with rival ideologies, very different political systems, is mostly structural. Competition is now baked into this relationship. A competitive approach to China was inevitable, but keeping it healthy and not pernicious is vitally important, and that won't be easy. To compete effectively, President-elect Biden will need to get the dimensions of competition with China right. So what does that mean? For many Americans, the goal of China policy has come to be one thing: achieving reciprocity. To most people, that means we will do with China only what China does with us. We will punish China when China harms us. The ongoing administration made this idea of reciprocity the very foundation of its strategy toward China. The strategy declared that the U.S. would welcome economic relationships rooted in reciprocity, implying that America would shun any and all economic relationships that lack it. This vision was welcomed by many at home and even some allies. At one level, this isn't surprising. It speaks to an American fundamental sense of fair play. It's simply unreasonable for Beijing to expect the rest of the world to keep its markets open to China unless China continues to open its markets to the world. I've long made this argument myself, but this cannot be the end of the story. Here's the big challenge. America has an open economy, which is our greatest competitive strength. China, by contrast, has an economy that is closed in many areas. But whenever an open economy mirrors the actions of a closed economy, the open one inevitably starts to close itself off too. If achieving reciprocity makes America's system more like China's, America will ultimately be the loser. We can't remain competitive if we become more like China, with its closed status model, which I believe isn't going to stand the test of time. So it's time to adapt our principal desire for reciprocity to the evolving and real-world needs of American workers, farmers, ranchers, and businesses, both small and big. It's time to move from reflexive reciprocity that responds fiercely but erratically by doing unto China what China does to us, to a policy that I call targeted reciprocity. We need reciprocity targeted to changing needs of the American worker. We need reciprocity targeted to keep American businesses competitive. We need reciprocity targeted to ensure that job-creating capital continues to flow to the United States. We need reciprocity targeted to ensure that best-in-class companies want to remain headquartered in the United States. We need reciprocity targeted not at anything and everything China does. Instead, the U.S. should aim its demands for reciprocity at sectors and areas where America is the strongest and most competitive. Above all, we need reciprocity targeted so that America doesn't become less American in the bargain. We must shift from reflexive reciprocity to targeted reciprocity that holds China's feet to the fire without making it harder for Americans to thrive. Targeted reciprocity would shift our strategy from reactive to proactive. It would leverage what's best about America without losing sight of what's most competitive about America. But the path to success begins at home. And the first step is to reinvest in the policies and values that have made America thrive. Many people fret that there will be a military crisis between the United States and China, and with good reason. But this is an economic competition, not a military one. Economic power is the foundation of military power. Economic power made America the world's growth engine. And economic power enabled China to become a growth engine more recently. So if Americans want to compete with China over the long term, we must re-energize the system that has made our country the envy of the world for generations. We must prove our economic model is better than authoritarian state capitalism. Our success or failure here will be the key to American global leadership, no matter what China does. We need to look to the future and design an economic recovery program that bolsters our competitiveness. That means supporting innovation, upgrading our social safety net while maintaining incentives to work, investing strategically in infrastructure, reforming immigration policy, and importantly, addressing our structural fiscal deficit. Targeted reciprocity is the best means to execute this agenda. And that brings us back to China policy. the first priority must be rebuilding the global economy in the wake of COVID-19 and creating job opportunities for Americans while reducing economic disparity. As the two largest economies, it is in the interest of Americans, Chinese, and the world that the U.S. and China find a way to reboot global economic growth. Relentless, debilitating competition where the two governments seek to curtail all trade, investment, and technology flows between them will make that very difficult. Of course, investments that threaten our national security should be prohibited. But we must be careful to avoid sequestering so much technology that American companies lose their ability to commercialize and deploy their products in the world's fastest growing markets. Companies need to know where the U.S. and China are going to cooperate, where they are going to compete, and where they are adversaries. We need major adjustments to our economic relationship with China, but we must reject the increasingly popular idea that merely having an economic relationship with China is somehow bad. What we need is one that is better suited to America's own interests. The economic linkages that are the rightful source of so much tension today do, in fact, benefit us in important ways. So here's what an agenda built on targeted reciprocity looks like. President Biden is a multilateralist. He understands we should be working with other nations to press China for structural economic changes. Biden should coordinate with leading economies to upgrade the global trading system in its governing bodies, like the WTO. Global rules for trade, investment, technology, the environment, and the digital world now lag behind reality and must be updated. If these allied economies can agree on a framework, they will be in a far stronger position to invite China to join, if it's willing to meet their agreed standards. If Beijing refuses to join this effort and remains inflexible, we should look to a punitive toolkit built on targeted reciprocity that includes jointly withholding access to our markets. Of course, that brings us to the question of bilateral tariffs, which have been the central feature of the Trump era. Tariffs are a tax on Americans. Their erratic application has harmed the U.S. reputation as a global supplier and a safe harbor for investment. Much of the damage has already been done, and still our trade deficit with China continues to rise. So we should now link tariff removal to a new approach founded on targeted reciprocity. I would only remove existing tariffs when we have extracted a reciprocal and tangible benefit from China, met by defined benchmarks in a phased bilateral trade agreement. The Biden administration should initiate a comprehensive new round of bilateral negotiations with China. It should aim for a fair, sweeping, and reciprocal trade relationship based on more meaningful competition. Here is the nub of the strategy. Instead of President Trump's emphasis on outdated, ineffective purchase agreements, we need to focus on the future by opening key areas to investment and export. We must tackle the market distortions of China's state-owned firms, and we'll need to deal with structural and process issues that include services, not just goods. The agreement should be done in phases with regular deliverables, beginning with easier issues that build momentum to tackle the tough ones. In return, the U.S. should be prepared to open its own markets. We also need to be more consistent and predictable. Achieving this will be hard, but it will be helpful in creating jobs and assuring a more fair and equitable recovery. President-elect Biden can expand market opportunities for Americans and bolster global growth in the bargain. Another important component of a refreshed agenda is to forestall environmental catastrophe. Climate change is the most certain and formidable economic challenge the world faces. As governments develop their post-pandemic recovery strategies, promoting environmental goods and services should be a core part of fiscal stimulus plans. China took a positive step with its carbon neutrality pledge, but we should consider climate change as another economic issue that demands targeted reciprocity. For one thing, working with China is in our self-interest. If we want to prevent the worst climate outcomes and preserve essential and fragile global ecosystems, we need China to solve its massive environmental problems at home and adopt better practices abroad. America also needs to capitalize on huge economic opportunities in China and globally. That means ensuring opportunities for our businesses to invest in and export clean energy products and technologies, as well as environmental goods and services. The Biden administration plans a fresh start in climate diplomacy, beginning with the Paris Agreement. So we'll have a new opportunity to rethink the international climate architecture. By now, it's clear that aggressive, voluntary climate targets are insufficient. We need to create a structure with teeth, one that focuses on the major economies, including China, and deals squarely with the problem of free riding and create strong incentives to curb emissions. This should include jointly bringing clean energy technologies to the scale necessary to address climate change. We each also need to provide incentives to channel private sector capital into innovative solutions that support green development and value nature. In the same spirit, our two countries should lift tariffs on environmental goods and services. China has resisted WTO negotiations to do just that, making it difficult for U.S. firms to fully participate in an estimated $3 trillion opportunity in China to help clean up its polluted air, water, and soil. Once again, targeted reciprocity can be a negotiating tool and lever to help all of us, including Beijing, make concessions that are in the global public interest. Ladies and gentlemen, the discussion at this forum is vital. We're in the midst of a turbulent and painful period. Yet for the first time in years, we have opportunities to make a fresh start. Our first goal must be to crush the virus. Our second should be to reduce the risks, unpredictability, and volatility that have damaged our citizens' livelihoods and businesses both large and small. This is President-elect Biden's essential task, and it is our essential task. Getting strategic competition with China right will, quite simply, have to be part of this. Competition without unnecessary confrontation should be our goal, because confrontation without effective competition has produced some poor results for the American people. It has damaged our economy. It has stunted our export opportunities. In time, it will threaten the peace of the world, and it does not make us safer. And so we will have chaos and conflict if we cannot get this right. This is in no one's interest. Not America's, not China's, not the world's. A clear-eyed but productive U.S.-China economic relationship built on targeted reciprocity is what we need now for the United States to restore and strengthen its global leadership, create a safer America, and support world peace. Thank you very much.
And of course, Hank Paulson there. Thank you so much for joining us for this first session of the 2020 Bloomberg New Economy Forum. A great start this morning. The next part of our program will begin promptly at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It will feature remarks from Zheng Peiyan, co-chair of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, also a conversation with Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong on the future of trade, a discussion on the post-pandemic world with former President Bill Clinton and former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, and also a conversation with Micheál Martin, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland. My co-host Scarlett Fu will be on hand to guide you through that program, and I will see you back here tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again, everyone.
really open up until 20th of September, so which means 6 months, the airport was closed. But the most effective one was actually the interstate traveling from state to state, not only here, even in other African countries where you are not allowed to move all over the place, and the farmers were not able to sell their produce. Small and medium enterprises were almost shut down. Restaurants were shut down. Hotels, up to now, I think they have just about 15% of capacity. So when you look at the economic impact for us is huge. But the human impact, as at today, we have about 65,000 cases thereabout in Nigeria, and we have 1,165 deaths. So it's not really much compared to our population, which is a population of 200 million. But because of the economic impact, a lot of people couldn't really go out to make their livelihood. So what we did, we have this coalition against COVID-19, of which I actually mobilized the private sector, and we raised the sum of $112 million. And what we did was now to go all out and set up 39 isolation centers, of which the smallest one is 100 beds, and biggest ones are 200 beds, and they have ventilators. We bought, they have ventilators, they have all the equipment. And then we also, said, okay, fine, what do we do after these isolation centers? Now, people were not able to afford money to eat. So what we did, we went out and we bought food for 10 million people, which is 5% of the population. That's people at the lower bottom of the pyramid. And what we did, we took 10 million people and we said, okay, fine, these 10 million people, it means that you have a minimum of about 1.7 million households, and we gave them food and we distribute. So that one actually reduced the effect of the, lockdown. So that's what we did.
Thank you so much, Likudangota. Dr. Farmer, can you give us, you've worked on Ebola, you've just written a book on Ebola that will be published tomorrow. How is COVID-19 different to other pandemics? How is it different to other health crises?
Well, there are lots of ways in which it's different. First of all, it's a respiratory virus, which, of course, enhances the possibility of going from an epidemic to a pandemic. I have a friend who likes to say, excuse me, epidemics are inevitable, pandemics are optional, meaning in order to respond, we need exactly the kind of interventions that I'm proud to say both my co-panelists here have engaged in, both the economic and protective ones that Aliko mentioned. That is, how can you really have isolation units if there's no food, this just doesn't work. We know that from the Ebola epidemic. And then what Nubar has worked on, and I'm in Boston right now, and I can tell you that the city is celebrating. We need these new tools that can change the face, not only of this pandemic, but of others. So, there's a tough few months ahead, but I think all of us are feeling some relief, no matter how ambivalent it is, because of all the losses we've faced.
But Dr. Farmer, what we're talking about almost day in, day out, and to a certain extent it's very surprising, is that we put the economy against actually a health crisis. I mean, what needs to come first? If we fix health and people stay at home, is that how you fix the economy? The Asian, countries seem to have gotten it better than a lot of our Western countries.
Well, the countries that have done better, and as Aliko mentioned, we'd be making a mistake to not look at some of the successes in Africa as well. But just thinking about, let's say, South Korea or Singapore or Taiwan or China, they have invested massive amounts in social distancing, universal mask wearing, and contact tracing. And contact tracing is a messy affair. It's not easy to do. But I think one of the things that we're seeing now in the United States is you could call it a containment fatigue, but it's really a kind of containment nihilism where we have people saying it's just not going to make a difference given the avalanche of cases. And that's not true. We still have to invest more heavily in some of those same public health standards. And that's going to be true even if we get 10 more new vaccines. It's going to take a long time. I'm sure Nubar can talk about the logistic challenges. But as an implementer, I mean, right here you have people who are involved all along this, call it a supply chain. You have, people who are steering business practices and capitalism towards a more humane and new economy. You have people and companies like Moderna that are developing new technologies, in this case, a new preventive, and then you have the implementers. And I'm really one of the latter group, and I can tell you that there will be substantial challenges to rapid uptake of the vaccine. And it's not just vaccine hesitancy, but questions of refrigeration, logistics, where is their cell tower coverage, where is there not? So it's going to require all of us to go all in just to take up these new tools. So I think we're going to have to remember our old public health lessons in the months going forward as well.
So, Dr. Afian, now that we have the formula, or we think we have the formula that could be approved, what are your main challenges to actually distributing the vaccine? What are the main challenges to keeping it, at adequate temperatures?
Well, Francine, one of the things we were also excited to announce today is that just late last week, we obtained data on the stability of the vaccine that looks to be even better than we had previously indicated. Specifically, our vaccine requires storage at minus 20 degrees centigrade. There are others that are at much lower temperatures, but we've developed technology to keep it at minus 20. But what's exciting is that we've also shown that we can actually keep the vaccine just in refrigerated 2 to 8 degrees centigrade conditions for 30 days without losing stability. And furthermore, at room temperature for 12 hours. And so what that means is that from a supply chain standpoint, yes, we need minus 20 degrees capability at a central storage capability, but from there, distributing it to the point of administration and keeping it under refrigerated conditions for up to 30 days, and then keeping it at room temperature is a significant improvement than where we thought we would be going into this. So that's going to help. The things we have to work out is literally just that. The production ramp up is occurring. We need to, of course, put in place the type of vigilance you need, pharmacovigilance, in all the countries that we'll be operating in. Moderna is a young, scientifically oriented company. It does not have the kind of legacy of pharmaceutical vaccine distribution that we will need here. So we're developing a lot of these and partnering with folks with the expertise to make sure we do this as safely and as effectively as we can.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone watching us at home or in the office or wherever you are, you can submit questions via the live Q&A feature. And I'm getting a couple of questions, which I'll get to in a second. But Aliko Dangote, what did this pandemic teach you? And then Dr. Verma will come in. What did this pandemic teach you, Aliko Dangote, about private and public partnerships coming together? Is this, if we are to be also optimistic, can we work better together in the future?
I think, Francine, to say the truth is that, we need to work together. Both private sector and government, they are natural partners. So I believe that we need to really work together, because without working together, there's no way we'll be successful. So I think going forward, not only, private sector and the government, I think even the various countries, they need to really come together and fight this common enemy. But with the lessons that we've learned with COVID-19, I believe we'll do much better in the future if there's any other pandemic that affect us. So I think we will be much better prepared.
Thank you, Dr. Farmer. You want to jump in?
Well, it's along those same lines, Francine. I would imagine most of your viewers understand that this progress is incremental. And, just taking the great news from Moderna today, it's not as if you go to Nigeria and then suddenly those rolling out the vaccine have to develop an altogether new cold chain and distribution network. In fact, Nigeria, and Aliko has worked on this quite a bit, has been working on polio eradication for many years and quite intensively. And that's been a public-private partnership with the Ministry of Health and other ministries in the Nigerian government, working with people like Aliko, but also with the Gates Foundation, which has put hundreds of millions of dollars into eradicating polio, which, we have some hope of seeing in my lifetime. When the Ebola vaccine, which is a very different kind of vaccine from the one Moderna has just announced, when that was developed, it was used in places using other vaccine supply chains, right? But one of the reasons that Ebola never really spread in Nigeria after it was introduced there from upper West Africa was because of the contact tracing teams that have been set up to work on polio. So I'm just saying, Francine, that your viewers and all of us should understand that one of the reasons Aliko is right when he says things are going to be better next time around is if we don't keep forgetting these lessons learned and we keep developing new technologies that are better and safer, we have reason to believe that it's going to be a long time before we see another massive pandemic like this, because we know how to act more quickly and in concert.
Dr. Afeyan, is this a game changer because of the type of vaccine? So I'm not a virologist, although as a member of the media, I feel like I've had to try and become one. But, talk to us about how this vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine are different to other vaccines and how they can help us in the future.
Happy to. So the technology that Moderna has developed is generally called messenger RNA based. And you may remember the kind of central dogma of how biology, how information works in cells is that DNA is copied into messenger RNA is copied into proteins, and that protein is what actually does much of the functional work. Antibodies are proteins, enzymes are proteins. So those are the components that actually dictate function. And in fact, it is a protein that causes the immune system to recognize a virus. And what messenger RNA, which had never been used before, about 10 years ago, Moderna's pioneering efforts in this area, and it takes quite a long time to establish the foundations of the platform needed to safely design and make these products. But what we're now able to do is to basically take an information molecule, messenger RNA, that codes for whatever protein we want, in this case, the spike protein that is on the surface of the virus, and just by using that information, instruct the cells in a human's body to make just that protein. So we come in with the code, our cells know how to convert that code into the business part, which is the protein. Once the body makes that protein, our immune system thinks that it's been infected and starts raising antibodies that attack that protein. And of course, what those antibodies then do is stay on guard, looking for said protein weeks, months later. And of course, if the virus does show up, the body is prepared with very precise immune instructions to defeat it. And that's why we're able to afford a vaccine that could be 95% effective, because in those subjects in the vaccine group, the immune system was almost in a military sense on guard for the very threat that they were trying to protect against. So messenger RNA is a very interesting enabler because it's an information molecule. Previously, vaccines have been made out of either attenuated viruses, so the actual virus, but defective in some way so it doesn't replicate and infect you, or proteins that are made artificially through biotechnology techniques. The problem with that is every single one of those proteins is a multi-billion-dollar effort of a decade to design the process to make and scale up, etc. So that's one thing. And the second, basically, it turns out that process is something your body can do. So this gives us the ability to very quickly make yet another one, and your body does the rest of the work. So it's got a lot of promise. I'll say that Moderna, previous to today, had already taken into the clinic 10 different vaccines. And it is the work on those that allowed us to very quickly jump on this bandwagon. So this is kind of the beginning of another armament, but there's many other innovations that will come along. And the way, as Paul said, we're getting better and better, and frankly, more and more courageous at using advanced technologies and science to battle these. Historically, this industry has convinced itself that things take too long, they cost too much, and that has caused people to effectively think this is not a place where investment should go, and therefore we don't have as many effective vaccines as I suspect we will in the future.
Very interesting. Aliko Dangote, I have a question from the audience for you. On equitable distribution of the vaccine, do you have advice, Mr. Dangote, for Dr. Nufian and Moderna specifically for Nigeria, Pan-Africa?
I think for Nigeria and Africa, we will not have any problem in terms of distribution, refrigeration, and distribution, because this is not really any different from the vaccines that we have worked with, which is the one for polio, the immunization vaccines. So distribution and the infrastructure is not really going to be a big issue for us because we have already, have this infrastructure. So, and what we have also done, we have this this thing that you call the Africa Center for Disease Control. They will also help in terms of the distribution. So it will help quite a lot, for us to get the, to purchase drugs, to purchase the vaccines, and also to be able to distribute them equitably. So I think we will not have any issues, both in Nigeria and also all the rest of Africa, in terms of the distribution of the vaccines.
I have another question for you, Aliko Dangote. What role do corporate leaders need to play in the distribution of the vaccine, in encouraging of mask wearing, and encouraging skeptical folks to get vaccinated?
Well, I think the private sector will help in terms of resources. Just like what we did, in Nigeria, we have to partner with the government because most of the distribution is being done by the government, but then foundations and private sector will get involved. Just like what we did between ourselves, Dangote Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Gavi, and the rest in terms of the polio vaccines, to be distributed. So I think now we have learned quite a lot with COVID. We know exactly how to work with different governments, and I'm sure it's not going to be an issue.
Dr. Farmer, is it up to leaders, business leaders, to do that, or will citizens really almost around the world require a new social contract with their health ministries, with their governments, and how will that change?
Well, just sticking to that continent, and as an American, who has worked and lived 10 years in Rwanda. Rwanda, yes, it's a much smaller country than Nigeria or the United States, but they have done superbly in terms of building up a delivery mechanism, and their rates of vaccine uptake are much higher than, with many vaccines, are higher than in the United States. And there's also seems to be less hesitancy as well. So I think there are lessons we can learn from many places all over the world. I share Aliko's optimism on this score, I am, like I said, as an American, I'm worried for my country as well, because you have studies showing that up to half of Americans wouldn't take a COVID vaccine without a lot more data and experience, and that's troubling. And I think that can change very swiftly. But we do have a significant problem of mistrust and division. And again, that's related very much to economic issues. So back to your question, I think that the private sector, after all, Harvard University, Partners in Health, the Gates Foundation, the Dangote Foundation, these are all private sector institutions, just like Moderna. So working together with public health authorities is key, and we need business leaders, people like Aliko, to continue to lead. And it makes a big difference. We've seen it again and again.
What about regulators, Dr. Farmer? How do you change the narrative in, telling people? And then the same question for Dr. Efeyan. How do you make sure that people say, right, this is a vaccine. I trust the regulators. I trust that I'm safe if I take it. And I have to listen to the science.
Well, Nubar is going to know more about the ups and downs of American regulatory systems, but I can say they're quite not rigid. They're quite emphatic about following a set of very conservative rules, and I have faith in those rules. Unfortunately, as you know, Francine, there have been attacks on the FDA and an undermining of the CDC and a questioning of the value of science. And the science and institutions like that are tough enough to take it. It's really the public losing out that concerns me. So we have a lot of work to do on building trust, but I think our regulatory agencies are really pretty solid. And if they can be kept out of the political scene, or politics can be kept out of the regulatory agencies, I think that we'll see improvement in the short term and more uptake of the vaccine, or whatever the vaccine may be.
Dr. Afeyan, can you give us, your insight into how difficult is it? I mean, what's the biggest challenge now? Getting people to take the vaccine, or deciding who to give it to first?
Well, look, the decision on who to give it to first will, in fact, be squarely in the hand of the governments that are operating in any given jurisdiction. And in the U.S., that'll be the CDC laying the guidelines. And frankly, as a private sector participant, I quite like that, because I think we'd be in an impossible position to make such determinations. And in terms of the regulatory process, I agree with Dr. Farmer in that I think the U.S. regulators and regulators around the world have a lot of experience actually using science to make decisions, which ultimately are decisions that compare the risks and the rewards of any given intervention under the circumstances we're operating in. There's a finite risk of actually contracting the disease for a certain population. It can be fatal. It can be quite debilitating for those who even survive it. And so we have to kind of balance the risk and the reward. There's no such thing as a risk-free way to deal with this type of a situation. And what the producers of these vaccines will do is to generate, with the best possible approaches, the data needed to be able to make these decisions. The thing we have to realize is that the more data is generated upon further administration and early distribution, the more there will be a body of fact to base this on. But I agree as well that it's been extremely disheartening to see kind of science and expertise twisted in so many ways over the past few months, either to kind of overstate all the ways in which this can go wrong and the likelihood that none of this will work, or understate the nature of the threat, the effectiveness of what we can do about it through behavioral modifications, or the possibility that antibody treatments, vaccines, and the like could in fact rise to the challenge. And I'll tell you, there's been a lot of dogmatic thinking that has completely confused the situation, partly because people have said all previous vaccines, for example, have taken 5 to 10 years to develop at a minimum. Therefore, anything that takes less than 5 years to develop must not be done safely. Well, that's a political statement, even by scientists. That's not a scientific statement, because that takes out of contention the possibility of innovation and progress that still succumbs to the appropriate safeguards. So I look forward, and of course, we're living moment by moment in this world of social interconnections through the media and through internet that makes us constantly think about the topic more than ever. I think over some period of time, people are going to start resolving in their own minds who they believe, what they're willing to do, and what benefit they expect. And I think this will begin to resolve itself. It's the only way we're going to get out of this, in my view, is that the collective immune system of humanity mounts an effective defense against a predatory virus that is abusing our social nature. Basically, but for our social nature, this virus would be long extinguished. But we're not willing to be completely non-social, and therefore we need to protect ourselves. Our immune system can be trained to do that, and we're seeing the first signs that it can be effective.
Right, and then there's a whole concern about asymptomatic people and stuff like that. But Dr. Afeyan, have you seen an unprecedented, coming together of public and private partnerships, of actually money coming together? And is that going to continue for decades to come in dealing with the next crisis?
Boy, we have seen an unprecedented collaboration, and I'd say an unprecedented willingness to spend capital at risk. I'll tell you that Moderna, being a fairly recently a public company from the point of view of trading on the stock exchange, went out early this year and obtained from our shareholders initially some $500 million and eventually well over $1 billion of at-risk capital to deploy itself to be able to move much more rapidly than we could even get government support to be able to do this unprecedented task. The government, through the U.S. Operation Warp Speed, joined, BARDA did, in supporting us very, very strongly, all at risk, without knowing whether the vaccine would work at all. And so did they support many other companies, some very large pharmaceutical companies. And we're very, very glad with that. The NIH, who has partnered with us, the National Institute of Infectious Disease, headed by Dr. Fauci, has been our partner for many years. And that partnership absolutely kind of saved the day in terms of enabling us to work very quickly towards getting a clinical program off the ground. There was no way within a few weeks of knowing the sequence of this new virus that we could have entered clinical trials. So anywhere you look, there's been unprecedented collaboration. There's been collaboration among the companies, the data sharing. We are using standard testing protocols, standard clinical protocols, so that people can confidently compare our results. None of this was happening before. But none of this should be the subject of a pandemic, because none of us are disadvantaged at acting this way. And to your question, Francine, looking forward, I certainly expect and hope that out of this, we will at least take away the lesson that we cannot wait to become sick in order to have ways to treat our condition. I would contend to your listeners that we have a healthcare system that can be best described as a sick care system. And the problem with a sick care system is that it doesn't do much to protect those before they are sick and to avoid getting sick. And that mindset has to change. We now know enough about our immune system and how to get it ready that I think there can be many, many new vaccines. In a general term, it seems like an old concept, but the modern vaccines will be able to precisely tune the immune system to any number of threats, present or future, such that we can be actually very rapidly mobilizing. If we cannot, as a society, change our social contract, someone mentioned about that, so that we demand from our governments expenditures that are not oriented towards sick care, but rather what I call health security, expenditures that can get treatments ready and tested, then I think it will have been a missed opportunity to do something good from the pandemic.
Aliko, thank you. Aliko Dangote, do you feel the same? Do you think there'll be much more funding, much more money from private individuals or the private sector into trying to find some of these challenges and fix some of these healthcare concerns?
Well, I think now, just like what Afed said earlier on, if you look at it before, nobody believed that you can actually go and get a vaccine within a period of 4 or 5 years. But with what really happened today, with the success of Moderna, with the success of Pfizer, I think people, the private sector, will be able and willing to pump in so much money and partner with the pharmaceutical companies. So I mean, people are not really going to be scared about investing. Now people know that it is possible. You don't have to wait for 4 or 5 years to have a vaccine. I think it's going to be really, really good for for even us in the private sector to take that risk and give a seed money for a pharmaceutical company to get a vaccine. But like what you said in the other question, whether we will accept, I would like to just say something. In Africa, normally, once it is approved by other agencies and also especially WHO, we will not have any problem in terms of using the vaccine. It shouldn't be an issue at all.
Aliko, how do you think we'll deal with the next pandemic? Will we deal with it better? Do we have, the tools to deal with it better now? And how will it be different?
I think it will be different because, other pandemic, we've learned quite a lot. It's just like what Dr. Farmer said earlier on. We learned quite a lot in dealing with, Ebola. And if you look at it, all the equipments that we had during Ebola, we just updated them, just like the infrared cameras, like the Infectious Disease Center, which we built here in Nigeria, Dangote Foundation built in Ikeja. We use it at the beginning of the crisis of COVID. So I think it is not really going to be, an issue. We have learned quite a lot. I think the lessons that we've learned, especially with this deadly pandemic, has given us a lot of ideas of what to do in the future in case there's any other one.
Dr. Farmer, how do you see the next? I mean, we don't know what the pandemic is. We hope we don't have another pandemic. But what are the lessons learned this time that will service us for the next one?
Well, one of the lessons that is worth underlining is, as has been pointed out, we don't have a healthcare system. We have a sick care system, but our sick care system is sick also. I'm switched hats to speak as an American. We have a very fractured sick care system. And when you're sick or injured, you need that sick care system. And the general terms that I would use looking forward are, it will be a huge mistake if we continue to fail to invest in robust health care systems. So all of the things that you've heard described by Aliko, in Nigeria, these were investments in the healthcare delivery system, right? Whether you're talking about a treatment center or a infrared camera to detect a febrile traveler, or vaccine distribution points, the cold chain. These are part of a healthcare system. But there are a lot of places in the world where there just really aren't functioning healthcare systems. And in these clinical deserts, that's where these pathogens, and they're mostly viruses, that's where they spread, and they can emerge from there as well. And I've worked in a lot of clinical deserts, and I've seen them watered quickly. For example, when I first went to Rwanda, they were recovering from, the genocide, and it was, as you might expect, a clinical desert. But they put in place the staff, the stuff, the space, and the systems required to deliver not just curative care or treatment for injuries, but also preventive tools like the ones that Nubar is talking about. So I really, really hope that that's one of the lessons that we take out of Ebola, out of influenza, pandemic influenza, and most of all out of COVID-19, is we really have to put more of our resources into a healthcare delivery system that is able to prevent illness and injury as well as respond to it.
Dr. Farmer, what do we misunderstand about healthcare systems in Africa?
Well, I mean, I think when you go to, I'm using this term clinical desert as we would speak of a food desert. But why did Ebola really take all of its toll in the 2014 epidemic that went on for some time, only in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea? It did not take its toll in Nigeria or in other neighboring countries. It was really largely limited there. And when there were secondary cases in the United States or Europe, they were stopped. What we need to learn about care delivery systems in Africa is they're just as varied as anywhere else, right? You have countries where there are strong systems, you have districts where there are strong systems. They can be in the same country as a district with very weak healthcare delivery systems. And each place has its reasons, right? There could be a history of conflict, of drought, of all sorts of things, including the massive underinvestment in healthcare delivery of colonial rule. I mean, that just ended recently. I was around the planet in any case. So those are investments in some places that have never been made. Again, what are they? Staff, nurses, for example, doctors, technicians, managers, stuff. We have a new vaccine, that's stuff, right? Space, safe clinical spaces. This is a pathogen like Ebola that spreads between caregivers. What does a safe space look like? And finally, systems. Try distributing a vaccine without systems and you'll see that it doesn't work. So those are the kind of dull as dishwater investments that we need to be making in our, in the jargon of my field, that's just called health system strengthening. And although it is dull sounding and sometimes dull in doing, it is critically important if we're going to prevent catastrophes like this from taking hold in the future.
Dr. Affan, are you already working on trying to prevent the next pandemic? I mean, I know you said, it's what we're doing at the moment is having a healthcare system that treats the sick, and we need to treat people before it happens to that. But again, how do you also make sure that the next pandemic is stopped on its tracks?
Well, and I would say that by coining it as a pandemic, we kind of think about it as something that happens once in 100 years, and so therefore, one might think, how do you know where it's going to come from, what it is, etc. But the reality is that, all new pathogen infections have a possibility of that. And if you treat it as though they don't, then some subset of them will become epidemics and then pandemics. And so I think what we are doing, just so I can kind of maybe think about the cutting edge technology that's being developed, we now have enough understanding about the sequence of these various viruses that we can actually, ahead of time, look at every single genetic change that virus could undergo and figure out the subset that would allow the virus to live, for example. That will define the living space that virus can occupy. We can also determine of those possible virus variants, for example, from the SARS-CoV virus, of which this is a variant that we saw, what are the common vulnerabilities, the spike protein that they share, against which we could make one common vaccine that could treat many of them, if not all of them. For example, those Achilles heel sequences are being identified, and we are actually quite actively working on that. Then, of course, with the messenger RNA technology, we have the ability to very rapidly take any sequence and convert it into a vaccine we can test in animals. So that capability applied to not one virus, but 20, 50, 100, all of that can now be done through what humans have developed and the technology that actually is going to benefit from this experience. So I think that, we're less going to spend time trying to speculate what the next pandemic might be than to guard ourselves. And this is why we call this health security. We think that we need a global pathogen shield, not unlike missile shields that have been developed in the military or nuclear shields that have been developed. We will come under attack. And the concept of a shield has to invoke our immune system, and then the information that we could glean about the nature of the attacker. All of that is being done. And of course, doing that requires long-term thinking, long-term investment, and regulators and governments who are willing to invest in the preparedness that somehow the world has de-emphasized over the past years, certainly decade. And we just cannot let that happen. The problem with pandemics is they come rarely, and therefore people assume, well, I've got insurance against that, I don't have to do anything else. But that's the wrong mindset. We just lost, millions of people. We will have lost certainly over 1 million people, and who knows where this ends. And I think the technologies exist. The regulators have to be more thoughtful about it, and governments have to think of this as part of their security guarantee to their populations. That is to protect their health against these kinds of threats. There's a lot we can do, and I expect we will do.
Aliko Dangote, what are some of the conversations that you're having with your government in Nigeria, other governments in Africa, to maybe put in place some of the things that Dr. Affan was just talking about?
Well, I think what we're doing right now, first of all, with the case of this pandemic, we have actually realized and we noticed that we have underinvested in our healthcare, just like what Dr. Farmer said in Africa. We need to invest more money in our, health infrastructure. But going forward, for us in Nigeria and also, Africa, we have what we call the Africa Center for Disease Control, and this, this is one of the things that will coordinate all the activities to make sure that smaller countries where they don't have, first of all, they have to raise money. Secondly, is to buy vaccines and also drugs for this pandemic. And smaller countries that don't have the means of getting people to help them, they will send people down there to see how they can assist them. So I think going forward, we shouldn't really have much, issues. It's just that we have to keep investing heavily in, our health sector.
Should we talk, Aliko Dangote, more about funding? Is this one of the main barriers to actually dealing with, a health crisis effectively?
I think, yes, I agree with you. It's more to do with funding. I mean, like what we are doing in Nigeria as a foundation, we are trying to sponsor a bill to our Congress where we want them to impose a tax. This is a separate tax, not the corporate tax, a separate tax of maybe about 1% of all our profits in the private sector, so that they will fund they will fund health. And I think it is the only way. You know, we cannot just leave government alone. Government alone cannot fund health. So we, the foundations, the private sector, and then the government, we have to actually work together to make sure that we fund health. You know, it is a very, very important sector. And, you know, without healthy population, there is no way you will have a healthy economy.
Dr. Farmer, so I have a question actually for all three of you, saying that this person's writing in, so thank you so much to all of you who are writing these questions. I believe all three of the panelists have worked with Bill Gates in one way or another. Just how critical are his contributions to the broader effort to battle the pandemic? I don't know whether you want to talk about the Bill Gates Foundation, Dr. Farmer, or just the need of some of these, you know, names that everyone convalesces around.
Well, yeah, I'll just put it in stark terms. You know, I started medical school in 1984, and this field that we now call global health was really, you know, dead in the water. It was uninspired, it lacked ambition, and it was called international health at the time, or even overseas health, you know, where you need to ask the question, well, which C are we talking about? So it wasn't just Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates, and actually Bill Gates' father was involved as well in starting this foundation. Really kind of did CPR on global health because not only was it starved for resources, as long as it involved poor people, it was starved for resources, regardless of where they lived. And so this generated a new wave of interest, and also led to a lot of development of new techniques. So you know, if you think about polio eradication, we haven't eradicated any pathogen except for smallpox, really a human pathogen, maybe rinderpest in cattle, maybe guinea worm is coming, but polio, to wipe that out, when that happens, we should look to Melinda and Bill Gates and say thank you. And if I could extend this metaphor, though, a little bit, Newbar's metaphor about, or the immune system as more than metaphor, you know, we need to think about how to protect ourselves by extending our metaphoric immune system as well. I mean, when we talk about essential workers and then don't make sure they have unemployment insurance or protection, when we see families, I mean, you know, all of us know people who've lost their jobs, and all of us know people who don't have, in this country, in the United States, who don't have adequate health insurance, and they don't have employment insurance. So I think this idea of us being at risk and doing things to protect ourselves, a shield, as it were, that needs to involve a new way of thinking about the economy as well. And I believe that this is one of the areas where Bill and Melinda Gates they've learned a lot on the way as well. They've taught us a lot, they've invested a lot, but they're seeing more and more, again, when Ebola came along and they were talking about polio eradication in Nigeria, it was turning that system towards Ebola that slowed it down. That is, investing in healthcare systems for a reason, but make them nimble enough so that they can turn on a dime and make sure we protect the essential workers, not just the doctors like me, but all of those who are required to help us respond to health crises like this.
Dr. Afeyan, I mean, this has been a pretty terrible pandemic because of the lives lost, because of the number of people infected. If anything good or hopeful can come out of the pandemic on how we can do better, what would it be?
I would say more courage, more investment, more collaboration, and not accepting the status quo. Let me come back and address something Paul just mentioned about the immune system. I actually agree completely that if you think about all of humanity as one entity, then the medical profession, the healthcare system, is our immune system. And metaphorically, in terms of if we were one body, that would be the organ. It's actually an organ. And when that organ is failing, when that organ is damaged, then we're not going to be able to mount a proper immune system across the population, not within our own bodies. It's no different. And any more than we would want a failing liver or a failing kidney, we need an active immune system. And I think that is the way to think about it. That's the first thing. And the second thing, to your question about what could come out of it, I mean, look, we're talking today about pathogens and disease threats of the sort that COVID-19 is. But let me just point out that a pandemic, more broadly speaking, is anything that affects all the people. And we have many, many pandemics, diseases that affect the whole global population, against which we should mount the same optimistic crusade to try to defeat it, in my view. And that's something that I believe should come out of this. People should feel more confident about what we can do if we work together and put the resources in. And I'll mention one thing. We're talking about spending more. I actually think we need to look for the day where we spend less on health. And among the way we're going to spend less on health is that if we spend less on sick care and spend more on securing our health, the two go hand in hand. Think about the analogy to the military. Yes, you want to have expensive weapons, but you want to use them sparingly because you want to put a lot of money upstream, never to have to use them. I don't see how it's any different. I don't see how. So I think there's a lot of things that will be changing our mindsets, and we look forward to it.
Aliko Dangote, maybe the final word from you on what we have learned. If anything good can come out, good or hopeful can come out of COVID-19, what would it be?
Well, something good will come out of it. I believe now what we'll do is that, with the vaccines that, they are going to, release very soon, we need to now see, okay, fine, how do we get back to, how do we go back to pre-COVID in terms of the economy, and also how do we stimulate consumption, how do we stimulate investment, and how do we get back to pre-COVID? And I think what we need to do in Africa is mainly to make sure that we get people back to work. Areas where they have suffered, they are still suffering, we need to get them back on track so that the economic activities will return back to normal. And I'm sure we'll do that. We've learned a lot, and I'm sure, we'll get onto that.
Fabulous. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Dr. Nubar Afeyan and Dr. Paul Farmer, for your valued insight. We, of course, extend our gratitude to you, Aliko, and the Dangote Group for hosting this session. And thanks to everyone listening, and have a great day, everyone.